What I want to talk to you about today, I basically only have two, there are really only two big chunks of brain function you need to succeed in school. One is your language system, and the other one is your executive system. Today I'm going to talk about the language system, but inevitably the executive system is going to jump in there because nobody gets anything done without an executive system. That's what the term is, it's executing things. But I think we have enormously forgotten about the language system, partially because of the overshadowing of non-autistic children by autistic children. I'll give you one other little anecdote. About a year ago, at our National Academy of Neurology meeting, I was socializing with a friend of mine who is a true pediatric neurologist and who is a researcher in San Diego at the University of California, San Diego. And I said, Doris, how is your research going? She's a famous researcher on language disorders. She said, I can't get a population. I said, why? She said, my grant states that I'm going to draw from practices, speech-language pathologist practices around San Diego, and there are plenty of them. It's a pretty sophisticated community. But she said, when I get in touch with them, they say, oh, we have hardly any language disorders. Everybody's autistic. And I don't believe that for a minute. I think that there's been a vast overdiagnosis of autism, and now that they're making the category even broader, where it's almost like what used to be minimal brain dysfunction. Any of you old enough like me to remember the term minimal brain dysfunction? It was sort of this big umbrella that would encompass anybody that had any hint or clue of some sort of central nervous system delay or deviance due to which it was just sort of a great melting pot, shall we say, of anything neurodevelopmental, which in its time was not so bad because it was the 60s and there was a great prevalence of old-fashioned psychodynamic psychiatry. And as a matter of fact, when my earliest days seeing children, the parents would come in and they'd say, my pediatrician wants to know, is this minimal brain dysfunction or is it emotional? That was the big differential diagnosis. Was the driving force a psychiatric disorder? Well, I think that's outlived its usefulness because psychiatry has moved on a great deal. And psychiatry now, because of the utilization of neuroimaging, has become much more allied and integrated with neurology, particularly the child field. We have very, very little conflict or differentiation. For instance, autism is researched both from psychiatry departments and from neurology departments, and they work together. They're not trying to make combat over whether it was caused by refrigerator mothers. Nobody believes in refrigerator mothers anymore. So we're now in a period, however, where autism, which was so long almost shunned as being too horrible to contemplate, and people underdiagnosed it, to where every child who has language problems, which almost inevitably give you social problems, I would say, is called autistic. In other words, you have to be almost like a social genius with your language disorder in order to escape being called somewhere in the spectrum. You know, I get these referrals all the time saying, do you see children in the spectrum? I said, well, until I see them, I don't know whether the person is in the spectrum. Do you mean your child has? Give me some specific disabilities they have. And that's why I want to go back and remember about language, because it's so fundamental to, of course, social, but I'm going to try to push it towards the academic. Hope this advances, yeah. So I'm just going to talk about specific language impairment, and then slide it into mostly reading disabilities and reading comprehension. We won't have time really to tackle math very deeply. But that's a beautiful summary which was done by Dr. Dunkowski, not by me. I love it. I'm going to keep it. But I don't think I can cover all of it. Now, what is language? I mean, it's such a complicated bunch of brain functions. It involves the analysis of speech sounds, rapidly changing speech sounds, encoding and storage of a big load of multi-layered information. And by the way, I'll just slip in here, for example, that bilingual exposure from as early as possible is wonderful, but people have to realize that those children are not going to speak as early. They're going to have a great advantage, ultimately, but often people are not aware of the fact that they shouldn't get excited if bilingually raised children can't get their mouths in gear to say everything as soon, because they've got more synonyms for everything and more different sentence assembly rules, etc. But amazingly, if you spend time with, let's say, an 18-month-old who's been raised by a Spanish-speaking nanny and an English-speaking mother and father, they'll understand in 2 languages, and they'll be able to go fetch things or say yes or no for the names of foods in both languages, etc. But they will take a longer time to get their mouths in gear. No question about that. What is specific language impairment? It's supposedly you can rule out a general cognitive deficit, which means they're supposed to have some evidence of normal intelligence. This is easier said than done, especially in young children, because, first of all, they're not great test takers, so we have to rely a lot on anecdotal information. If we have to rule out hearing, of course, as a problem. And supposedly we rule out autism. Well, as I started out by saying, right now autism is like the fog we had this morning. It tends to descend over everything. So that's not so easy either. And if you have specific language impairment, you will almost invariably have some kind of school problems. Interestingly enough, not always appearing at the same stage. Now, how do we get anecdotal evidence? Well, for example, in many cases, children who have a language impairment at the same time will be very good at, for example, I can remember many stories of children who could go into the kitchen at the age of 3, get the step stool, get up on the stool, get the cereal off the shelf, get the milk out, find a banana, maybe not be allowed to use a knife, but crack the banana with their fingers into small pieces and get their whole breakfast fixed. So that's the kind of, that's a perceptual motor intelligence. You know what goes into your breakfast. You might not be able to go ask somebody to do it for you, but you can do it. Or they can be good with puzzles. They can be showing, for example, ability to assemble things in other ways. The famous story about Albert Einstein was that he was a delayed talker, and he not only could take things apart, but unlike most 3-year-olds, he could put them back together. I mean, we know 3-year-olds can all take things apart. But you have to take a very, very intensive history to get the evidence of other cognition being intact, because we're not supposed to apply the term language impairment if there is a general cognitive deficit. By the way, and you all know now that it is politically incorrect to say mental retardation. Have you all been schooled in that? We now say intellectual disability. But that's kind of funny because, in fact, in order to be called intellectually disabled, you must be shown to have adaptive living non-IQ impairments. So it's kind of, again, it's not the greatest language precision to call it intellectual disability when, for example, if a person had a very low IQ, but their adaptive capability in everyday life was approaching the lower limits of normal, you wouldn't call them intellectually disabled. So it's not easy, but of course the older they get, the better you can use standard IQ tests, and I'm happy to tell you IQ testing has improved under the influence of my field, which is really neuropsychology, which is the intersection between psychology and neurology. So now the IQ test doesn't have 2 sections, it has 4 sections, and the section on the perceptual index is really much more truly a perceptual index now, because it teases out a lot of the speed factors that we used to contaminate it with. Okay, why do people have a specific language impairment? Probably certain connections in their brain are And here's where we don't know, because we don't have funded research to follow people. We don't know if it's late or never. But in terms of a child's education, late is going to be the same as never. You know, if I told you this person is going to be wired up like a 3-year-old by the time he's 10, that wouldn't really be very comforting. I mean, it would be in one sense. It's not like saying your child has a brain tumor that's going to kill him or something like that. But on the other hand, a lot of things, and now with ADHD, just to give a sidebar, we do have a lot of evidence that uncomplicated, genetically determined ADHD is probably a pretty marked developmental delay, because we do have signs of catch-up. But even there, the detriment to your functioning can leave impacts on you that make it not so trivial, even though I can say, well, listen, by the time you're 35, you'll probably be possessed of a brain that looks just like your brother's, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're not going to have a heck of a lot of trouble. So the left side of the brain is where the language systems are heavily based, yes, even in left-handed people. Most left-handed people still have their language basis in the left hemisphere. We don't understand left-handedness to this very day. Isn't it amazing? We have 10% of the population. Most places have left-handed people, and lots of mythology about left-handed people, but we don't really understand exactly. They're somewhat differently organized brains, but not really with respect to language so much, more with respect to other functions. And with MRI, which is magnetic resonance imaging, we can look in certain locations. I won't bore you with them. But sometimes there are both sides of the brain, sort of like the left and the right glove, the right side is also involved. And those tend to be more severe cases when the structures that are the homologous structures on the other side are also anomalous, too small, or strangely formed. We'll have a worse prognosis. Also, subcortical, below the cerebral cortex, in this place called the basal ganglia, which you probably have heard of in conjunction with Parkinsonism. The basal ganglia are an important part of cognition also, and the thalamus, which is a sort of relay station for a whole lot of things. And we currently are scratching our heads over some very current findings we have about reading comprehension and the thalamus. So we have a big conference call coming next week to say, what have you been able to find in the literature and what have you been able to find? So the thalamus is still there because it's a relay station for all sorts of sensory and cognitive inputs. And when we find these things on MRI, of course, it's cross-sectional. We don't have somebody who is born into a family with language problems and that we can follow them and see this is the chicken and this is the egg. We don't know these things yet. It's enormously still mysterious. As a matter of fact, this week, 2 articles crossed my desk. I would say on Wednesday. And I have them with me. I just grabbed them. One of them had something to do with children whose mothers were folic acid deficient in utero are more likely to have language disorders. And another one has something else about language learning in the womb, that were both about prenatal things having to do with language, which just came into my office this Wednesday. So, you know, stay tuned. There's going to be a lot more. There's also a lot of nonsense. I always find the problem, you know, the web is wonderful, but it's like trying to look for the wheat amidst the chaff. You know, you have so much complete mythology and garbage to winnow your way through. Anyway, recently there's been a lot of anatomy that shows that the specific language impairment brains are very much like dyslexic brains, that they have somewhat different asymmetries, in other words, they have tissue distributed, sort of the opposite of what is advantageous for language. And specifically, there's a little gyrus that's connected with hearing and on the top of the temporal lobe surface, and also this symmetry of the planum temporale. Now this is very interesting. The planum temporale is an auditory association area, and I also want to make a little commercial here. Please, if you're either receiving or giving reports on children, don't tell somebody someone has an auditory processing problem. because you are speaking too broadly. The left planum temporale is an auditory processing area for speech sounds. And that's usually what these tests are all about. But please don't condemn people to the term poor auditory processing when you have not tested music. You have not tested discrimination between environmental sounds. Look at all of us now have to distinguish our ringtone on our mobile phone from somebody else's. And before that, we had to distinguish the doorbell from the phone, from the dog barking, from the cat mewing, from human speech. All of those are auditory processing. They are not what is on the tests that have to do with your school progress. So please, let's call it speech sound processing. If you want to be pompous, you can go with phonological. But I was like, ordinary English is preferable, so just say speech sound processing. And the fourth thing is, very important, your right planum temporale processes what is the emotional state of the person who is talking to me. Not what we call prosody for grammar, like whether this is a question or this is a command. That's a different kind of prosody. That still stays on the left side. But the right planum temporale processes, this person is angry with me, this person is happy with me, this person is happy to see me, this person is grumpy, all of that. So auditory processing, there are at least these four big, there's the linguistic, and then there are the three other things. Now, this is what's so kind of unfair about the human brain. If you are to be a good linguistic processor and probably a good student, effortlessly good student, your left planum temporale is 10 times bigger than the other side on the right that has three things to do. It's kind of, you were going to ask me a question, yes?
I just, it's very interesting. You missed a slide that I really would like to hear. Right before this one, if you can just talk about it. Right.
I missed a slide?
Yes, before this one.
Oh, I don't think it's very interesting at all. I mean, all it does, it's just a shopping list. I mean, all it says is that these are the diagnoses you can find listed in the manual, and since that manual is going out of use as of 2 months from now, it's even less interesting because it's going to be a DSM-5. All that is a shopping list of what are recognized diagnoses in DSM-4. Okay, that's all it says. DSM-4 subtypes. So I don't think we need to spend any time on it because, as I said, DSM-4 is on the way out. There'll be a whole new list, and they'll be equally meaningless. I just had it there so you know that that there is such a thing as official diagnoses, but it's far from clear that they really conform to what the research is showing. Okay, but the really important thing about the planum temporale being symmetrical, meaning that it's interesting. People with language disorders, they don't have less on the left, they have more on the right. So it's not that they have a lack of the left, but that there is more symmetry. Now, what that means is that there's greater competition between speech sound processing and all this other stuff. Here's a practical implication, clinical. I'm telling you this is clinical experience. I wish somebody could do an experiment on this, but I don't quite know how you do it. But I have found over the years that if I have a child with a language disorder, and often they are called dyslexic, but they really have a language disorder, since the borders are what I want to tell you are very fuzzy, if that child has a teacher who is a grumpy, yelling, never say a negative voiced teacher, that child will suddenly be unable to take actual verbal instructions from that teacher. Even if the teacher's grumpiness is not directed at them. Even if it's a generic, I'm a grumpy person. So grumpy people, you know what they sound like? You know the voiceovers in the Charlie Brown cartoons? You know how every time an adult is talking, there's no words, but it's always like... And so I have found with some kids where I can work closely with a school, I'll say, you've got to change this kid's teacher. This kid, because the kids will not process. I have an interesting anecdote from my own life about this. My middle son who, to skip to the good part, is a very successful business entrepreneur, I would say he was one of these people who always existed on the fringes of language processing. He was in the good old days when he could drag the bottom of the class in reading, and we didn't really have to give him any special tutoring. We just sort of let him limp along, and around age 10 he learned how to read. He couldn't make it now, but anyway, I used to, my youngest son, who was very, very academically gifted, never believed me that his older brother had this problem, because he worshipped him and he thought he was the greatest thing in the world. He said, "Oh, Mom, you can't be." Well, the youngest one was a computer guy, and his older brother, the one with the language wobbliness, was away at college, and he was trying to write a big paper, and something went wrong with his computer. So he called his younger brother, and his younger brother was trying to walk him through, you know, computer help stuff. And of course, the guy who was having the problem was very emotionally upset because he had a deadline with paper. Well, my youngest son got off the phone. He said, "Mom, you're right." He said he wasn't processing anything I was saying to him. And he said if I got annoyed with him, he processed less. He said, the more annoyed I got is, "Didn't you hear what I said?" He was getting, and I said, yeah, that's what I'm talking about. You have to go almost to the nursery school saccharine tone of voice with these kids, you know. It's like Oscar Levant, who is probably somebody most of the people here don't remember, but he used to talk about Dinah Shore. From listening to her, you could get diabetes. You really have to err on the side of nothing negative in your voice at all if you're a parent supervising homework, or a teacher or a tutor with these kids, because they really have too much competition from the emotional. So it's a very practical thing, is that emotional processing of auditory information is going to swamp the verbal content, the literal verbal content of what you're saying to them. So that's why I think that's important. Now, nobody's done research on it. I just have experienced it, and I would ask you to look out for it. But it's something, I mean, it's in the department of, it's a non-toxic treatment, so why not try it, you know? I mean, you know, but it does mean that teacher grumpiness is not a trivial thing, you know, and a generalized negative environment is not a trivial thing. How pure is specific learning, language impairment rather? Usually, this is a sad thing about girls. Their nonverbal IQ is linked more to their verbal. It's the bad side of a very well-integrated brain. A girl with a language disorder will tend to look worse even in nonverbal areas as she gets older. I don't want to go into a whole sidebar, but this is a fascinating thing about the differences in the two genders, is that there's greater interhemispheric connectivity for girls than for boys. And the normal situation for girls is that they truly dominate their right hemisphere with their left. And when their left hemisphere has got something deficient, it sort of leaves their right hemisphere a little bit adrift. And they don't hold up as well on their nonverbal functions as they get older. Now, most people who have a specific language impairment, even when they're picked up early, even when Child Find gets them all wired up with the right connections and they're going to the right school, very often people make the mistake of saying, oh, they have been brought up to criteria. And then they kiss them goodbye, and they fall right into the reading disability trap. Many of them have a coordination problem, and if they do, it's more likely to be fine motor than what is commonly called gross motor or athletic coordination. And a lot have an overlap with ADHD. This is why we never can get away from ADHD and executive functions, because any developmental disability within the category of, you know, you have normal IQ, but you have something, one-third of those people have ADHD. So, and a lot of the time, the ones who don't have ADHD are going to compensate fairly well with minimal help. So the ones that are really going to be longer-term issues for their families and for their schooling are the ones who are in that 1/3 group. The prevalence of pure language impairment, specific language impairment, is only 3 to 6%, but it's a very heterogeneous group, and the dynamics of who moves into that group and out of that group clinically are very, very heterogeneous, and we really need more research. But unfortunately, a person like my friend Doris, who is exactly the right person to do that research, is having trouble getting the starting cohort because, as I said, she's getting blasted with everybody being called autistic or in the spectrum, which is the latest buzzword. The largest group of language impaired have a mixture of expressive and receptive. Now, expressive is always a lot more obvious. Receptive is, you know, it takes much more careful looking for it. Because, of course, if these children have normal cognitive function, they're very good at using their eyes and sizing up what the heck is supposed to be going on and give you the impression that they're understanding, for example, in a group situation, just by following what their neighbors are doing. But they may have a lot of receptive problems. And as we just said, very easily interfered with by negative emotion, either generalized because of the teacher or specific because they had a fight with a friend or something went wrong. A big controversy, and very much provoked by the autism issue, is should the pragmatic learning language impairment be kept as a category within SLI. Pragmatic would mean what do you say to whom under what circumstances? I think nowadays that would really drag you into the autism category. Caveat about that, however, is what about all the kids with ADHD who blurt things out? They may be called they may be called pragmatic language impairment and therefore sort of dragged into the borders of the spectrum. But actually their problem is simply that they suffer from what an adult patient once came to me and said he had disease. And I was going to look it up because there is something called Moya disease. So but it turns out that what he meant was on my mind, out my mouth. And that's something that kids with ADHD often suffer from. And it is a pragmatic disability. I have a story about myself. When I was about 4 years old, I come from a family where my mother was the youngest of 13 children, so I had a lot of cousins who were the closest to me in age, or 10 years older than I am. And I had been told about my certain cousin whom I adored having had some very successful treatment for acne. And so when she came to visit, I threw my arms around her and I said, "Oh, Pearl, your pimples are much prettier." Now that's great at 4. Nobody's going to fault you because you're not supposed to have that much impulse control at 4. But you can imagine if you were 6, it would not be acceptable to be mentioning somebody's pimples. So that is pragmatics but that's the kind of thing that kids with ADHD can do, is sound like much younger children who just anything that's on their mind comes out of their mouth. So it's another one of those diagnostic confusables, this whole idea. Yes, sir?
The ADHD versus ADD is the ADD.
Oh, there is no official diagnosis ADD. We all say it, we talk it because we like to say fewer things than more things. There is only ADHD, and then you have to say predominantly inattentive or combined type, or in very rare instances, predominantly hyperactive impulsive, which usually applies only to children in preschool. But it's just the way the manual is written.
Earlier on in diagnostic.
Earlier, but very much earlier.
Versions of it.
This is almost 20 years ago. Almost 20 years ago, there was ADD. And we all grabbed onto it because we really, first of all, we all agree that the H is the most superficial part of the whole thing. But nonetheless, these powers that make up the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual since 1994, and they're going to preserve it into the new one too. It's called ADHD, full or combined type, because you're not going to see many of those hyperactive impulsive all by themselves. and then predominantly inattentive. So you may speak colloquially, you may even speak with your doctor saying ADD, but if I make a slide, I have to say ADHD. Okay. Yes.
I have a question about kids with reception disorders, and when you measure their intelligence on an IQ test,
Yeah.
is it possible that the whole score is deflated because they...
No, actually, quite the opposite. One thing about the verbal IQ is that it has very minimal demands on receptive language. It's constructed in such a way, that's the good news. The bad news is that a kid can get a very respectable score on it and you won't know. And what you really need, and this is, we don't have, I actually use a research test which involves specifically testing whether children understand syntactic constructions. And for example, this test is full of embedded clauses and passive constructions that children will need to understand to read. But you won't need anything that fancy because the whole verbal IQ, do you give IQ tests? Is that what you're asking? No. But if you do, the IQ test sort of entrains you in a certain, you know, what's the same about a this and a that? What's the same about this and that? I mean, it's so repetitive that, you know, you're gonna catch on to it almost from the rhythm of it. But it doesn't have, for instance, on this syntactic comprehension test that I took from a research group in Boston, and I've been reading, a lot of the things I do in my own clinical evaluation are not from standard manuals. What I do is I use them in research and I gather norms from, we always have to have a control group of children who don't have problems. I don't like to call them normal. I call them typically developing or no problem children. So we build up this large number of norms, and then we have things like before and after questions. Those are pretty simple. Like before the door was opened, the boy put his coat on. When did the boy put his coat on? So all you have to do is say before, whatever. But some of them, the last one I love because even bright young adults will get seduced by the sentences. The man promised the lady who was sick to go to the hospital. Who went to the hospital? Now this grammar says the man. And when you think about it, he could be going to the hospital pharmacy to pick up her drugs. But people get seduced into saying the lady who was sick because they hear hospital. So if they're not really processing the syntax of the sentence, they will get it wrong just by guilt by association of sick lady with hospital. And believe it or not, this is very predictive of reading comprehension. You may not talk in daily life that way very much, but boy, you read sentences like that all the time. And it's one of the very neglected factors in evaluating kids with reading disabilities, whether with listening comprehension of things like that, they can actually cope. Okay, now developmental specific language impairment. Here you might have a later onset of talking and a slower rate of development. It might mimic the normal pattern, but you're 2 to 3 years behind everybody else unless you get a lot of help. Often grammar, what we're just talking about, is the persistently worst feature, and that bodes very poorly for your reading comprehension. Word finding difficulty, again, I will fault our existing anybody here a speech language pathologist? Your tests lack decent word finding measures. No, I mean, it's not your fault, but there's a lack of really good, and I think people need to look at, like, again, I use the Boston naming test that I took from the Boston aphasia battery, and I normed it and renormed it and renormed it, and it's amazingly revealing, you know. In general, verbs are worse than nouns, especially the morphology of verbs, meaning, for example, you get persistence of the infantile regularization of the past tense. For I took-did the last cookie instead of I took. I break-did my toy. They won't sound quite Elizabethan because they don't say breakhead, but they say break-did. I break-did my toy. Help me, Mommy. Well, that's okay until you're around 8 years old and you're supposed to be able to say I break, I broke. Those completely speech sound kind of things that you pick up because it doesn't sound good. It's the analog of proofreading. If something doesn't look right to you, it won't sound right to you if you have a good ear for the speech sounds in your language. Very often people neglect those little telltale signs when they do an evaluation of people who are in the so-called dyslexia category, which I want to rush to get to. So we still don't know, is it a limited processing capacity or is it processing speed? And I would guess that there'd be some who have one and some who have the other. We have multiple theories out there with multiple complicated names that I can't keep up with from the linguists. You know, there's a whole field of linguistics that doesn't care two hoots about people's brains or development, but they come up with fancy theories. I can't keep up with them. I don't know what they're talking about half of the time. But limited capacity would mean that you haven't got a hold on to it system in your brain to hold on to verbal and speech sound information, that it just slips out of the holding bin, so to speak, and you can tell that by sentence repetition. People who just can't repeat a sentence of beyond a certain length. It just won't stay with them. And slow information processing, which may not be limited to speech sounds, but in other words, that the wheels just turn very slowly. And so, for example, with respect to classroom instruction, the person may always be behind what the teacher is saying. Or in conversation. Teenagers with language impairment have often said to me, I have a terrible time. I try to keep my mouth shut because I often laugh so late that people think I'm weird. I get the joke so late. So I try not to even laugh. I try to just sit there with a poker face so it won't look weird. Okay, the academic course of specific language, even when the oral language, and when you've had the best kind of speech-language treatment and you seem like you're doing just great, you're often going to have problems, as I said, because in order to be a good student, you have to be what my friend Frank Bellatino, Professor Emeritus of Educational Psychology, calls, you have to be a linguistic gymnast. You have to be really above average. Your language can be okay for everyday life, but you may not be able to deal with the complexity and speed of language processing. So he calls it being a linguistic gymnast, to be good at language arts. Reading comprehension is more at risk, even if the oral comprehension seems to be okay, for the reasons I was talking to you about, the complexity of sentence structure. By the way, the most complex syntax is in math books.
Yeah.
Look at math books. Math books, when they're trying to either explain things to you or ask you problems, they have more conditionals and subordinate clauses and, oh my goodness. I once did an analysis of it with a young PhD candidate, and she came out with the idea that it's a wonder that anybody with a language disorder ever can do okay in math, unless somebody translates everything into visuals for them. Now, if your specific language impairment, especially expressive, is persistent past age 6, then you're probably going to also have trouble with even the basic reading skills of sound symbol association. And the core dimension of risk is phonology, the speech sound system weakness, but it can be compensated by semantics, by a broad vocabulary network. Now, I will just give 5 minutes to this, no more. I don't know if fast forward has already faded from public consciousness. How many people still are aware of fast forward? Well, it's very few. It was all the rage a decade ago. And basically, it was a computerized program that was supposed to cure you of your specific language impairment by slowing down the speech signals, and then when you answered correctly, they would make it a little faster and a little faster. Didn't work. It didn't, I mean, you could get a better score on what they gave you at the end of the thousands of dollars and hundreds of hours you spent on it, but it did not last. It did not cure you. It did not carry over. And this is one of the problems we have now. We have a whole area, a myriad of other things. I get deluged all the time. Will you do research on Brain Safari? Will you do research, Dr. Dencklal, on CogMed? All these computerized programs. And I'm an intense skeptic because having been through this fast-forward phase, these computerized programs, they always sound so incredibly convincing and scientific, and data goes back to laboratories, and laboratories make individual adjustments, and this happens and that happens. But the question is transfer. Does it transfer to the real world once you leave the computer? And so far, Fast Forward is the most famous one for language impairment, and it did not transfer past the end of the testing. Maybe a few months they looked like they were coasting on some improvement. And then the bear went over the mountain and saw another mountain and couldn't climb the next mountain. So it just didn't make permanent changes in the capacity of the child's brain. Anyway, now linked to reading disability, here we go. We go to school. Speech perception, as again, I wanted to emphasize to you, it's speech sound perception, not general auditory processing. That is really, that's an example of where I feel brain science needs to get together with education, is to be more precise. And you may say, why are you being such a purist? I have had parents come into my office and say, my son loves music, but I'm not going to let him fail because the special ed evaluator told me he has an auditory processing problem, so I'm not giving him music lessons. So that's why imprecise vocabulary that actually can negatively impact a child's life, I think, is not just pedantic. I think it's important to know that it's not auditory processing, it's speech sound processing when we give the clinical test of phonological processing. We're not testing whether Johnny can play the saxophone. So that's, if you remember nothing else, if there are two things I want you to remember when you leave here today is, one, emotional processing of speech can compete with ordinary instructional speech, and two, auditory processing is too broad, and many children who have speech sound processing problems are musical geniuses, and that may be the way they're going to make their living. So please just remember two things and I will be happy. Yes?
Can you just be a little bit more specific about what tests you think really clarify that there's a speech sound processing system?
Well, there's the clinical test of phonological processing. Probably the speech language pathologist can tell you some other tests that do that. That's one that's commonly used in a reading readiness kind of battery. I'm trying to accumulate norms on things for 4-year-olds. I've been asked by Fairfax County to try to come up with something for 4-year-olds to find out who's at risk for dyslexia. So we're trying to get 4-year-old sensitive tests of speech sound processing. And if this speech language pathologists have some suggestions for me, I'd be happy to hear them after when we're finished, okay?
What was your first point? I'm sorry, the emotional processing, your first point that you want us to walk away with?
And the other one is that auditory processing encompasses music, and music should not be condemned at the same time as you're doing speech sound testing.
Your
Yes.
first point, I think I missed, about the emotional processing.
Well, that the emotional speech processing competes with speech sound processing if you are not a standard person who has 10 times as much speech sound tissue as you have other auditory processing tissue. If you have equal amounts, and again, there is no lack of a left-sided system, there is just an overabundantly large right-sided system. So it's a question of balance of different inputs rather than one is deficient, really. But it can give you a competition problem. On the other hand, music can help kids with language disorders because if you set things to music, they'll remember them much better. Their tremendous, usually right hemisphere endowment allows them to memorize multiplication tables and things like that when they're set to music. Also phonological working memory, which you test by people being able to remember instructions over, for example, if you give an instruction to a class and then supposed to do a whole worksheet without having anything to refer back to, can they carry that? Can that stay in the loop? Excuse me, can that stay in the loop for them long enough to finish one page of work? And again, syntax, we mentioned already. Adolescent follow-up. Kids with language impairments still lag in the language areas, and mostly with girls, the IQ scores decline, although the boys' IQ scores decline also. And this applies not just to what is literally called the verbal comprehension index. Because as people get older, there's a lot of underground verbal mediation, The more complicated, so-called perceptual problem solving often is facilitated by your having, let's say, labels for geometric terms that you don't have to speak to anybody, but they're inside your head, and they're carrying some of the weight of the problem solving. You need to give them a foreign language exemption, because very often they cannot deal with speech sounds in a second language. It will be the straw that breaks the academic back to have a language. And we work very hard to maybe have them be able to substitute sign language for a spoken language. Very often they seem to have attentional and social problems. The attentional problem can be a pseudo-attentional problem. It can be simply that they overload and they do what I call blow a fuse. You know, they sit in so many classrooms listening to so many different styles of teachers as they're adolescents, and they're concentrating so hard in order to compensate that they literally, it's like the brain gets exhausted. And it's literally like plugging in too many things in one circuit, and their language circuit is already weak, and you try to plug into it for so many hours of the day with so many different styles of things. And the social problems, as I said, the kid who can't laugh in a timely fashion. Also, when he thinks of something witty to say, the time has gone by and it's not witty anymore. You know, so conversational social is often an impairment. Girls often develop emotional problems. Girls in general are more prone after puberty, after the hormones come in, to being anxious or depressed, but if they have language impairments, they really are very vulnerable. And the boys will have more overt ADHD diagnoses, and there I would say more the combined type. We find in general that girls have more of the predominantly inattentive ADHD, and the boys have more of the combined type. That's the more obvious type. Yes, ma'am?
On the previous slide, could you discuss this chronological working memory?
I prefer to move on because it'll come up again, okay? Here it is. Look at the slide. It says phonological memory. It's not just perception or low-level processing. For example, non-word repetition is very commonly, for example, being able to repeat back on one of the tests that I've used. You have a made-up word, tachyphemonopia, where all of you have heard supercalifragilisticexpialidocious, things like that. Being able to just faithfully, they just can't. There's something deficient in the holding circuit that just can't hold that much information, especially when it has no meaning. If there's meaning, the meaning sort of bolsters the holding on to it. But if it's totally nonsense, and think of foreign languages as a bunch of nonsense syllables, you know, that you're trying to hold on to. Dyslexia is actually a specific word disability. And that's more true than maybe people even realize. It is a specific case that illustrates the lack of the validity of an IQ achievement method of diagnosing learning disabilities. I'm going to go through this because I think this dyslexia affects a lot of children. Now, the interesting thing is, up until recently, I used to have to tell everybody you can't use the word dyslexia when you deal with schools. Fairfax County is going to allow the term dyslexia in their learning disability categorization. The new age has dawned. But you had to say specific reading disability. They didn't recognize dyslexia as a term. They said it was a medical term. It really isn't a medical term. But at any rate, 5% of the children are identified in schools, but they're probably far more than that, because research, if you go out and screen, will get up 15 to 20%. So that's a big difference between the 5% that schools are going to acknowledge, and 4 times as many boys as girls. I think that's still true, and it's even more true with this premature education thing we have going on. Research findings indicate that in research, you can actually find a lot of girls who are dyslexic, but they're not identified because they do not have any of the comorbidities that the boys have that make them more squeaky wheels. 1 out of every 5 children basically has, and I think it's more now. This work was done more than 5 years ago, and probably more than 10 years ago. And now with pushing the Common Core curriculum so that what used to be first grade is now kindergarten, I bet it's going to go up to 25%. This Connecticut longitudinal study done by the Shawitzes showed that 20% of children had difficulty in reading in 3rd grade, and of that 20%, 74% still had difficulty reading when they were in high school. So for all this, you have to be reevaluated every 3 years. People have a persistent, basic problem. They're behind, and they keep staying behind. And there's a very frequent co-occurrence, 30 to 35% ADHD. What is dyslexia? It's the problem with decoding of single words, and it involves rapid retrieval of a speech sound equivalent to something visual, which is what I got involved with when I created the rapid naming test as my beginner's luck when I was only 30 years old, and I made up this test, and it is now used all over the world to tell whether the circuit that goes see it, say it, see it, say it, see it, say it, see it, say it works at sufficient speed. Which that may sound very trivial to you, but if you don't do that quickly enough, how do you put those things together, either at the level of speech sound to word or word to sentence? And if you don't go fast enough, you tend to exceed your holding capacity and your working memory, and then you don't know what you've read. So it all relates. Speed is of the essence. Phonological awareness, we talked about the ability to listen to a word and hear what it would be if you took away a sound. Say cat, now say it without k, it becomes at. A very difficult one, say split. When you, by the time you're in 3rd or 4th grade, say split. Now say it without the p, and it becomes slit. That's more difficult when it's in the middle than if it's at the front or the back end of the word. And the phonological memory, again, holding a sufficient number of those units in your head so that you can hold them together and connect them with meaning. They have to be all there in enough of a short enough span that your brain can export them into the parts of the brain that can endow them with meaning. So the assumption through prior research was that if you just got through the decoding phase, comprehension would follow as night followed day. It's not true. It's been found that if kids reach the 3rd grade benchmark, this was a decade ago, so now it's going to be even worse, but a decade ago, if kids reach the 3rd grade benchmark and they pass their decoding milestones, that there would still be a quarter of them who didn't understand what they were reading. So you can do the math. I mean, if you had this, you began with 20 to 25% children had trouble. We remediated them. They learned phonics. They learned a certain number of sight words. They passed tests. And now you give them a reading comprehension test, and, you know, a quarter of them are not understanding what they're reading, even when we think we cured them. This may account for the fact that there's more research on phonological processes because everybody assumed what we call the simple view of reading, which is if you can crack the code, it's just like I was talking to you. But the problem is they don't recognize that a lot of people are not so good when I'm talking to you. That's my whole point of my lecture, is that the underlying assumption that all of these kids are completely possessed of processing of the English language is simply not true. So this is phonological awareness, and you test it also by rhyming, by the non-word repetition, and sometimes repeating digits, although that's less sensitive. Now this is rapid naming, made up by yours truly 45 years ago. And it's, you never give this test if the children can't say those 5 letters by whatever speed they can, and then you simply want to see if they can go through the 5 lines of randomized presentation of 10 times each for each letter, and it's how fast you can go through it. And there's a color one. The color one doesn't show up so well here because the photograph's too dark. But I'm happy to tell you that when I was teaching in China, that Chinese, which is not even a phonological language, it's strictly a sight word language, if you will, that this test works not with these symbols, but with but it works to tell who's dyslexic in China. So it is a neurological test. It tests the see it to say it circuit. I see it, I say it, I see it, I say it, I see it, I say it. And that retrieval, rapid automatic retrieval, even in a that's That's why it's the other partner. You have got all this phonological stuff that's important in a language that has an alphabetic basis. But in a non-alphabetic language like Chinese, which is ideographic, everything's a little picture. You know, my favorite one is that there's a symbol that means both crisis and opportunity, and it's a picture of two women under the same roof. That's what it really is. And I have a necklace of it that somebody gave me when I was in China. And it means crisis and it means opportunity also. So I think that's kind of beautiful. So they have, and of course their language has tonal, they must have very different brains because their languages, Mandarin uses 4 different tones and Cantonese uses 9. So you can have the same phonology. The famous one is ma. In Mandarin, ma can mean mother, which is nice because it also can mean horse. It also has 2 other things. It depends on whether you go ma, 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 or something else that I can't do, which goes both up and down. So you have to sing to speak Chinese, essentially, because the same little phoneme means 4 different things. But anyway, in our language, we use symbols, but I started this out with color naming many years ago. And with color naming, which at that time was something you expected in kindergarten, you could just see how fast the kid could go through the whole color card. Dyslexia probably has several subtypes. The really severe ones have problems with both the phonological awareness and the rapid naming. I'm not going to go into some of that science, but the rapid naming one also turns out it overlaps a little bit into ADHD, again, because whenever the front end of the circuit is involved, you get closer and closer to the frontal lobe, and things get a little more complicated. Anyway, this is Marianne Wolf, one of my students, who came out with this double deficit hypothesis. The normal reader has normal retrieval and normal phonological awareness, and the very impaired, severe ones who have to go to probably a special school have impairment in both. And then you get the 2 middling deficits, the ones who have impaired phonological awareness, but they have normal rapid retrieval. And then you have the normal rapid retrieval with normal phonological awareness. And that still has implications. On our reading comprehension study, we found that people who are in that so-called mild reading disability category often have comprehension problems just because they can't go fast enough to hold enough information in mind to process it. So it turns out that it does kick over into the moderate category if you add reading comprehension. And I love this. I get this from Hollis Scarborough, who's a very famous language researcher. And she says the fiber of reading, look at all the things that have to be woven together for reading. From language, you have to have background knowledge, vocabulary, the language grammatical structures, verbal reasoning in some cases, literacy knowledge, meaning you have some idea of what print is all about and how print is processed. And then you have, for specifically the decoding phase, phonological awareness, decoding, using the alphabetic principle, and of course sight words, which is a lot more like the Chinese. Like if a lot of little kids, you know, will learn that that says exit, as though it were just a picture. They don't know the words, but they know that that's what that means. And so that kind of sight word learning is much closer to what the Chinese do. And all of these strands are important for becoming a skilled reader, what my friend Frank Valentino calls a linguistic gymnast. And you can have reading difficulties from any strand, 1 or more, and the more strands you have weaknesses in, the more severe your reading disability is going to be. But the whole point is that that word language, look at how many different things are under language before you even get to the actual word recognition of written words. And that's an even more complicated diagram, which, again, the only point is to see how complicated it is. Now, what are the boundaries? I'm going to stop in a minute. What are the boundaries of dyslexia? Do expressive or receptive language? We find in our research that the naming test, that is not just the rapid naming, but something like Boston naming, which starts with, you have a picture of a bed, and you have to say bed, and it goes all the way up to the most difficult one is an abacus on the last page, that the children with dyslexia tend to have lower They may have low normal. They may have an IQ of 135, to answer the lady who asked about IQ tests. But if you sock it to them with a, I want the exact name of this thing, that they'll come out much lower. And because that is a very, very constrained and very academically relevant. All I have to do is tell parents, look, it's the right answer. Don't you know that school is all about the right answer? So well, let me give you an example of a dyslexic kid on this test. And I've seen this more than once. You will not believe it, but I have. There's a picture on this test of the device with which you draw a circle, that you put a pencil in, and you stab it. It's called a compass. I have many, many, many middle school age children who have reading disabilities who will stare at that thing and say, I can't tell you the word, but I know there's another meaning for whatever that word is, and it's for when you go in the woods and you want to know which way is north. That shows you the difference between semantic lexicon and the speech sounds that have to be the clothing, so to speak, of the concept. I see that so many times. People, I made a video of it to show to my class because people think, that can't be. How can that be? That you cannot say compass, but you know that there's something else that has that same unretrieved set of speech sounds that has another meaning. So it just shows you so distinctly the difference between what you would call a verbal intelligence, if you will, and a precision of being able to crack out the right answer. Yeah?
Is that the same kind of example as when we're giving a test and a child has to look at a picture and actually just say the word, but they look at the picture and they give you a definition, but they don't actually ever say the word?
Yes, that's called circumlocution. That's a formal name for that is you're talking about it. For instance, if kids do that all the time even with the abacus, which is the hardest word on the Boston naming test, many children with a lot of cultural exposure say, oh, I know, like if you go to Chinatown, they will use that at the cash register to calculate the bill. So they're telling you a lot of world knowledge about it, but they can't come out with abacus. Or somebody else will say, oh yeah, I know, I read about that. Marco Polo, he brought it back when he went to China. I mean, it's amazing. The kids will have such semantic enrichment, but they won't, especially if you're practicing in an area like around, you know, the greater Washington area. We have a lot of very culturally enriched kids, but you can tell it's a brain problem because they just can't say those precise syllables. Yeah?
Does that have anything to do with working memory, like long-term working memory?
No. First of all, you're mishing and you're moshing. There's no such thing as long-term working memory. Working memory is exactly not long-term. They are completely different things. So you've got two things, and you've taken the word memory, and you've done sort of like when you collapse a kaleidoscope, you've telescoped them into each other. They're not. Working memory is what's in your mind right this second to work upon.
The county keeps bringing up the two, long-term.
Well, they don't know. They don't know what they're talking about. I'm sorry, but that's look, there's a lot of sloppy terminology that I see all the time, and that's not just from the county. I see it from people doing private work too. Working memory is something that's sitting in your brain right now. For example, I have to have working memory for where I was allowed to park my car. I'm not going to hang on to that for tomorrow or even for an hour from now. I just have it there so that when I go outside, I'll find my car. It's a bigger challenge in some parking garages, isn't it? They all look the same. But for what?
So that has nothing to do with memorizing the word?
No, that's memory. That is actual learning and memory and storing it in memory. Working memory is what you're doing while you're reading something. While you're reading, you have to, each word is being put into your holding store, and then you connect it to meaning and you move on. Now, you may, when you connect it to meaning, hopefully, if you're going to be trying to remember it, you're going to take notes on it or do something else with it so that you give it another learning trial. Very few people are going to put it, a few very, very special people are going to put it into long-term memory right then and there. But that's not the same thing. the word working memory means I have it here just to do my work. Okay? It's not, then something else has to happen to it for it to go into storage. All right.
Is it word retrieval then? The ability to say abacus, or is that word retrieval then?
It is, but it's specific. But when we think about it, there's more than one kind of word retrieval problem, and here again, more research needs to be done. There are some people who are not thinking of even the shadow of the word, and then there are the far more numerous people who can think of the shadow of the word, but not the specific sounds that constitute saying it. You know, it's more like, it's like your own language is like a foreign language in that sense. You can't retrieve what those particular sequences of speech sounds are that constitutes the answer. And the way you can tell the difference, for example, is accommodation. I don't know if at McLean School you use this, is for kids who have word retrieval deficits, you give them a word bank. So let's imagine, for example, that we've given you a map of the United States, and you're supposed to, in the conventional test, fill in, you know, Missouri, Illinois, whatever. And those geographical terms and biological terms, by the way, are killers for these kids because they are totally like foreign language, the whole thing. But if you give them a word bank, which would be sort of like an alphabetical index of the 50 states, then they can go and find the one they want. So they have the knowledge semantically, but they don't, and they have it in their lexicon, but they don't have it to retrieve as a set of specific speech sounds, much less to spell it, because then the assembly line requires yet another thing, you know, which is a whole other day to talk about. Let me just try to finish, see if there's anything else I want to just get across. So the point I'm trying to make is reading is the tip of a language iceberg, okay? Reading exists at the top of this. Below the surface of the water, you've got pragmatic, semantics, syntax, and then at the border you have syntax and speech sounds, and the reading has to deal with the surface and then dip down below the surface to get the meaning of what you're reading. So it's a language art. We keep calling it language arts, and then we forget what it is that we mean when we say it. That there's a broader, deeper language disorder involving semantics and syntax that will impair your school learning, even when you do a bang-up job of remediating and passing tests in reading. Because on an ongoing basis, there's still usually a slowing, there's a struggle, there's a lack of automaticity to it. So many times you're still going to have a lot of trouble, even when you remediate the reading disability. And remember that, now this is out of date, probably needs to be moved up, is that learning to read is kindergarten and first grade, and second grade on is reading to learn. I hear about people writing in journals in second grade now. That's going on. Nobody wrote anything in the old days when my children were growing up until they got to third grade. And in reading comprehension, all of these things come into play again. So you get what I call an academic language disorder, meaning that you're just not quite good enough. You're good enough for everyday life, but you still have a language deficiency with respect to those academic demands. I have seen kids who had overt reading disability in the early grades that was said to be remediated, discharged from all special help. They come back in high school failing biology. What is biology? It is it's like a foreign language. And so they can't remember all those crazy Greek and Latin-derived names of bones and this and that and the other thing. And it's the same kid who was called dyslexic early on, whose difficulties with just simply being a capable phonological or speech sound manipulator and retriever are coming back, you know, in another form. And now everybody says, oh, Sally must have an emotional problem. Well, yeah, she has an emotional problem because she's failing in biology again. So we go through the same old song and dance about, is it emotional? Again, and then if I really were to go into reading, we have a lot of executive function involved also in reading, of course in all school skills, but reading comprehension seems on the surface so passive, but it is so far from passive because it is reading is such an unnatural activity. You know, reading is a very unnatural recent, it's not a biologically grounded activity, it's very specialized, and we act now like everybody's supposed to do it. So this is sort of the bottom line. Reading comprehension involves your general language development, that's why I have it up front, your executive function, and when you're much younger, you're decoding. But when you get past good remediation of decoding, you still have all that going on in order for you to understand. So I'm going to have to stop. You've got this printed out, but I'm sorry we started a little bit late and I went a little later, but I did take some questions. If you want, anybody wants to ask more questions, I'm happy to stay another few minutes.